Everybody, we need to talk about what is trending in the long-range forecast community right now, because over the past 2 weeks, the winter forecast for 2026 to 2027 has become the most discussed, most searched, most debated topic in all of long-range meteorology. And the reason it is trending is not because the models are showing a mild, comfortable, unremarkable winter. It is trending because the data is showing something that is making meteorologists across multiple agencies, multiple countries, and multiple forecast systems stop and pay very close attention. Long-range stratospheric data, the measurements of wind speed and temperature high above the Earth's surface in the layer of atmosphere called the stratosphere, is now showing a surprising polar vortex weakening trend for January and February 2027. Surprising. That is the exact word Severe Weather Europe used in their August 20th, 2026 analysis published 2 days ago. And last winter, the January to February 2026 cold wave, we already lived through exactly what happens when the polar vortex collapses. A sudden stratospheric warming event at the start of 2026 sent the polar vortex crashing southward into North America. 22 people died, $4 billion in damage, temperatures dropped to negative 43, 7 Celsius in Kirkland Lake, Ontario. Snow reached Texas and Florida. And now, the same warning signs that preceded that event are showing up again in the stratospheric data for January 2027, with a super El Nino that is confirmed at greater than 90% probability of being very strong. With Arctic sea ice at record lows, and with a stratospheric wind pattern that is aligning in exactly the wrong direction for polar vortex stability. This winter weather pattern is trending for a reason, and here is the complete, honest, detailed picture. Happy Thursday, everybody. Mark here. No hype, no drama, just what you need to know. Subscribe and follow along because this is the most important long-range weather discussion of the entire year. Let's get right into it. First, let me remind everybody what happened last winter, because the January and February 2026 cold wave is the most recent example of exactly what the current winter forecast is warning could happen again, and potentially worse. The January to February 2026 North American cold wave was one of the most extreme winter weather events in recent North American history. It was caused by a southward migration of the polar vortex, following a sudden stratospheric warming event at the start of 2026. The warming event occurred in the polar stratosphere. Temperatures in the stratosphere above the North Pole surged by tens of degrees in a matter of days. That dramatic warming disrupted the polar vortex's circulation, pushing its lower core to southward into North America. And cold Arctic air, which normally stays locked near the North Pole under the polar vortex's contained circulation, spilled southward across the continent. The reach of the cold temperatures extended far across the continent, reaching as far south as Belize. In Kirkland, Lake Ontario, the temperature dropped to negative 43. 7 degrees Celsius, that is negative 46. 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow reached Texas, snow reached Florida. At least 22 people died. $4 billion in damage. Several winter weather events associated with the cold wave proliferated across the United States, creating dangerous and sometimes crippling conditions across numerous parts of North America. That is what a polar vortex collapse looks like, everybody. Not just uncomfortable cold, deadly cold. Infrastructure crippling cold. Cold that reaches geographic latitudes where it has no historical business going. And the specific question that is now trending in every long-range forecast forum and every meteorological research platform, is whether the winter of 2026 to 2027 is setting up for the same event or worse. And the answer the data is giving right now is deeply concerning. Now let me explain the three-driver global trinity, because this is the framework that every major forecasting organization is using to assess the winter 2026 to 2027 polar vortex risk. And all three drivers are aligned in the same direction simultaneously. The polar vortex is a massive spinning circulation of cold air in the stratosphere, the layer of atmosphere between roughly 12 and 50 kilometers altitude. It sits over the Arctic from roughly November through March, containing the extreme cold of the polar region within its circulation. When it is strong and stable, the cold stays in the Arctic. When it is disrupted or weakened, when a sudden stratospheric warming event occurs, it collapses. The cold air escapes, and whoever is in the jet stream's downstream path gets the outbreak. Driver 1, the super El Nino. This is the primary driver. NOAA confirmed on August 14th. Greater than 90% chance of a very strong El Nino during the Northern Hemisphere fall and winter 2026 to 2027. Strong El Nino events generate enormous amounts of planetary wave energy in the tropical Pacific. The same Rossby waves we have been discussing all summer that create the wave-like atmospheric patterns across North America. Those planetary waves propagate upward from the tropical atmosphere into the stratosphere. And when they arrive in the stratosphere with sufficient energy, they can disrupt the polar vortex. Not a guaranteed disruption, but a significantly elevated probability of one. Severe Weather Europe confirmed the mechanism directly. A strong El Niño can increase pressure on the polar vortex and raise the chance of a midwinter disruption. A full collapse is not guaranteed, but the combination of tropical forcing and the emerging seasonal signal makes the stratosphere a key region to watch. El Niño winters have historically shown a higher chance of producing a polar vortex disruption or sudden stratospheric warming event during midwinter. The mechanism is linked to large pressure waves that can form from the tropical Pacific into the North Pacific and North America and then propagate into the stratosphere. The stronger the El Niño, the more powerful those waves. And this El Niño is tracking toward the strongest in 76 years of modern records. The wave energy being generated is correspondingly historic. Driver 2, the QBO. The quasi-biennial. Oscillation is the stratospheric wind pattern above the tropics, the alternating east-west wind cycle that takes approximately 28 months to complete. And right now, the QBO is undergoing a major wind shift, a stratospheric wind reversal that Severe Weather Europe detected descending through the tropical stratosphere and confirmed on July 8, 2026. It is now aligning with the west phase as we head toward fall and winter. And the west QBO phase is one of the configurations that tends to amplify the impact of El Niño planetary wave energy on the polar vortex. The stratospheric wind pattern above the tropics is literally steering the planetary wave energy from the super El Niño more directly into the polar vortex than would be the case in the east QBO phase. Driver 1 and Driver 2 are reinforcing each other. Driver 3, Arctic sea ice. This is the dimension that adds a third independent pathway to the polar vortex disruption risk. And its state right now is alarming on its own terms. Arctic sea ice dropped to a June record low as the super El Niño was strengthening in 2026. Severe Weather Europe confirmed it. And the specific regions where sea ice is most depleted, the Barents and Kara Seas, north of Russia, are the regions that research has most directly linked to polar vortex weakening in the subsequent winter. The mechanism is thermal. When sea ice is absent, the relatively warm ocean water below is directly exposed to the atmosphere. Heat transfers from the ocean to the air. That warming of the lower Arctic atmosphere changes the temperature gradient between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes. And that changed gradient, a reduced difference between polar and equatorial temperatures, is one of the physical conditions that makes the polar vortex less stable and more susceptible to disruption. All three drivers, the super El Niño, the west QBO alignment, and record low Arctic sea ice in the key Barents-Kara region, are simultaneously present for the winter of 2026 to 2027. Each one independently raises the probability of a polar vortex disruption. Together, Severe Weather Europe described it as a powerful global trinity controlling the seasonal jet stream. And the latest long-range stratospheric data is now showing that trinity's effect. The forecast line for polar vortex strength is dropping far below the long-term average in January and February 2027. That is the signal that is trending. That is the signal that has the meteorological community paying attention. Now let me show you the complete winter weather pattern that this setup is pointing toward, broken down by region. And then I'm going to explain the brutal piece, because this winter is not going to be brutally cold everywhere simultaneously. It is going to be brutal for specific regions at specific times, and understanding which is more important than any single temperature forecast. The baseline pattern, without any polar vortex disruption, is a classic strong El Niño winter. The northern half of the country trends warmer and drier than average. The southern tier trends wetter. California gets atmospheric rivers and above normal precipitation. Texas and the Gulf Coast see active storm systems along the El Niño-driven subtropical jet stream. Florida sees increased severe weather, including tornadoes from El Niño-enhanced jet stream energy. And the northern tier, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, gets the warmer than average, below normal snowfall pattern that classic El Niño winters deliver. That is the baseline. The nonpolar vortex winter, the pattern that forecasters are reasonably confident about. And then the polar vortex disruption risk changes the game entirely for specific regions at specific times, particularly in January and February 2027. When a polar vortex disrupts during an El Niño winter, the cold outbreak risk concentrates in mid and late winter, not December, not early January. The polar vortex disruption risk concentrates in January and February 2027, exactly when NOAA's ENSO data shows the super El Niño at or near its peak, and exactly when the long-range stratospheric data is showing the polar vortex weakening signal. And what does a polar vortex disruption during a super El Niño winter produce? It takes the mild northern tier that the El Niño baseline is producing, the Dakotas and Minnesota running warmer than average, and flips it suddenly and dramatically colder. A disrupted polar vortex during January-February 2027 could turn what looked like a mild winter in the northern states into a severe Arctic outbreak. Not for the whole winter, for specific, concentrated periods of 1 to 3 weeks. But those 1 to 3 week periods of displaced Arctic air can be deadly, can be crippling, can produce wind chills of -40 and -50 degrees across the northern plains and upper Midwest, can push dangerous cold as far south as Texas and Florida. Exactly what happened in January-February 2026. The brutal timing is January-February 2027. The brutal geography is the northern tier, northern plains, upper Midwest, Great Lakes, Northeast, during the period of maximum polar vortex disruption risk. And the brutal wildcard is that the El Niño-driven storm track across the southern United States means that when cold air from a polar vortex disruption collides with the active Gulf moisture and subtropical jet that El Niño is producing in the south, the collision zone produces major winter storms, significant ice storms, significant snowfall, in areas where the El Niño baseline alone would have suggested milder, wetter conditions. Now let me walk you through what the most respected seasonal forecast agencies are saying, because the convergence of their outlooks on this polar vortex risk signal is what has made this trend. Severe Weather Europe, whose analysis published 2 days ago on August 20th, 2026 is the most current published forecast, said it directly. The new update adds a stronger and more specific warning sign. Long-range stratospheric data now shows a surprising polar vortex weakening trend for January and February 2027. And they describe the specific outcome if the polar vortex fully collapses. With signs emerging for a weaker polar vortex in 2026, 2027, the Super El Niño can cause a strong enough disruption to fully collapse it. That can strongly increase the chance for more cold winter days and snowfall over the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe. The Old Farmer's Almanac, who has been tracking this winter setup for months, described it for Indiana and the Midwest as cold and snowy periods for the upcoming season, featuring sudden snow squalls, blustery winds, and frequent temperature swings between freezing and thawing. Temperatures average near normal overall, but interrupted by quick bursts of bitter cold and sudden drops. Quick bursts of bitter cold and sudden drops. That is, the polar vortex disruption signal expressed in language that farmers in rural communities understand immediately. Newsweek's interview with Old Farmer's Almanac meteorologist Sarah Egger captured the broader risk. A stronger El Niño typically strengthens the subtropical jet, which can send more storms into the southern U.S. And when these storm systems interact with pockets of colder air, they can produce significant winter weather, including snow and ice storms. She added, "For businesses, the stakes are high. For energy and transportation, it's really about the operational disruptions. Flooding, mudslides, ice, travel delays, infrastructure impacts, and rapid changes in demand. Rapid changes in demand on the energy grid, infrastructure impacts. That is what the collision of El Niño's active storm track and polar vortex cold air produces. And the energy grid vulnerability, which we saw demonstrated so dramatically during January, February 2026, when the polar vortex last collapsed, is the practical real-world consequence that extends far beyond weather inconvenience into genuine public safety territory. And the El Niño Guide's winter forecast confirmed the 3-zone structure of this winter with maximum clarity. The enhanced subtropical jet stream splits the continent into 3 distinct zones. The northern tier, Pacific Northwest through the upper Midwest and Great Lakes, typically runs warmer and drier than average under El Niño, as the polar jet stream stays bottled up in Canada. The southern tier, California, the Southwest, Texas, the Gulf Coast, and Florida, receives above-average precipitation from repeated Pacific storm systems. The central band, including the Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic, sits in a battleground zone where cold air masses can still intrude, making snowfall outcomes highly variable. That battleground zone, everybody. The Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic. Those are the communities that are most directly in the collision zone between El Niño's warm southerly flow and any cold outbreak that a disrupted polar vortex sends southward. And in a winter where the polar vortex disruption risk is concentrated in January and February 2027, when the Super El Niño is at or near its peak, that battleground zone is going to earn its name. Now let me address the honest caveat, because this is what I always do. And the honest caveat about the winter 2026-2027 polar vortex forecast is important. A disrupted polar vortex does not guarantee a major cold outbreak in the United States or Europe. Severe Weather Europe said it directly, and I want to make sure you hear it. A weaker polar vortex does not guarantee cold and snow for everyone. But it increases the probability that Arctic air can escape the polar region. That can turn a mild winter pattern into a sudden cold outbreak or convert a wet storm track into snow and ice. The probability language matters. Everybody. This is not a prediction that January 2027 will be the coldest month in American history. It is a prediction that the probability of a sudden, severe cold outbreak, the kind that killed 20,000 people and caused $4 billion in damage in January-February 2026, is significantly elevated for January and February 2027 compared to what the El Niño baseline alone would suggest. The baseline El Niño winter is mild for the north and wet for the south. The polar vortex disruption risk is the wild card that can turn parts of that mild northern winter into the most brutal cold outbreak of the season. The timing of maximum risk is January and February 2027. The geography of maximum risk is the northern tier, northern plains, Great Lakes, upper Midwest, and potentially the northeast and mid-Atlantic when the cold air reaches far enough south. And the severity of the cold, outbreaks, if they materialize, could rival or exceed the January-February 2026 events, because the Super El Niño's planetary wave forcing is projected to be significantly stronger than the forcing that preceded the 2026 disruption. This is the brutal pattern, not brutal everywhere all winter, brutal at specific times and specific places, with the potential for concentrated periods of dangerous cold that fall outside anything the seasonal average temperature forecasts would suggest. And here is the piece that makes this winter different from every previous Super El Niño winter on record, the one that changes the historical analog comparisons. Every major seasonal forecast agency uses historical analog years to build their winter forecasts. The years most similar to 2026, 2027 in terms of El Niño strength, La Niña transition trajectory, atmospheric conditions are 1997, 1998, 2015, 2016, and 1982, 1983. Those are the Super El Niño winter comparisons. But here is what none of those analog years had. None of them happened during a year when the global ocean temperature baseline was as warm as it is in 2026. None of them happened with Arctic Sea ice at the historically low levels measured this summer. And none of them happened on top of a climate system that has been running at or above the warmest year ever recorded levels for 2 consecutive years. The 2026-2027 winter is a Super El Niño winter on top of the hottest global baseline in recorded history. The analog years cannot fully capture what that combination produces. It is the same atmospheric range folding that Todd Crawford warned about in July, an El Niño so strong and a background climate so warm that the atmospheric response deviates from what historical analogs would predict. Some of those deviations may reduce the cold outbreak risk in certain regions. Some may amplify it in others. And the honest answer, from every seasonal forecaster who has studied this carefully, is that the January-February 2027 polar vortex risk period is going to be watched in real time as the most uncertain and most potentially consequential 2-month window in the entire winter forecast. Watch the stratospheric data. Watch the polar vortex forecasts. Watch the sudden stratospheric warming signals in November and December 2026. And when they start appearing, and the current data suggests they will, be ready. Because if January-February 2026 taught us anything, it is that when the polar vortex collapses and Arctic air spills southward across the continent, the transition from mild El Niño winter to brutal Arctic outbreak can happen in less than a week. Let me give you the complete winter 2026-2027 pattern summary right now. The Super El Niño baseline. NOAA confirmed greater than 90% probability of a very strong event for fall and winter 2026-2027. Classic El Niño pattern. Northern tier warmer and drier than average. Southern tier wetter with active subtropical jet stream. California active. Atmospheric river season. Florida increased severe weather. The 3-driver polar vortex risk. Super El Niño generating historic planetary wave energy toward the stratosphere. West QBO alignment amplifying that wave energy's impact on the polar vortex. Record low Arctic sea ice in the Barents-Kara region providing a 3rd independent weakening pathway. All 3 aligned simultaneously for winter 2026-2027. Long-range stratospheric data from Severe Weather Europe's August 20th analysis showing the polar vortex forecast line dropping far below the long-term average in January-February 2027. The brutal window, January and February 2027, the period of maximum polar vortex disruption risk. Concentrated potential for sudden severe Arctic cold outbreaks affecting the northern plains, upper Midwest, Great Lakes, and Northeast. Potential for collision zone winter storms across the Ohio Valley and mid-Atlantic as El Niño's subtropical moisture meets displaced Arctic air. Reference event, January-February 2026. North American cold wave caused by the same mechanism, killing 22 people and causing $4 billion in damage. The honest caveat, a weaker polar vortex increases the probability of cold outbreaks but does not guarantee them. The El Niño baseline remains the dominant signal for the overall winter. The brutal cold risk is concentrated in the January-February window and does not override the broader mild northern trend for the full season. But when it comes, if it comes, it will come fast and it will come cold. The unprecedented background. A super El Niño on top of the warmest global ocean and air temperature baseline in recorded history produces outcomes that historical analogs cannot fully capture. This winter is tracking into territory that has no direct historical precedent. Start preparing now. Know your heating system's limits. Know your community's warming shelter locations. Stock your emergency supplies before November. And watch the stratospheric data as we move through fall, because the January-February 2027 window is where this winter delivers its most consequential verdict. Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for your incredible support. And before I go, a quick word from our Father. Job 37, 9 through 10. From its chamber comes the whirlwind, and cold from the scattering winds. By the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen fast. Everybody, by the breath of God, ice is given. He controls the polar vortex. He controls the stratospheric warming events. He controls whether January 2027 sends Arctic air crashing into the United States or keeps it locked up near the North Pole. Every cold outbreak, every winter storm, every sudden stratospheric warming event, it all moves within the boundaries he set. And he holds every community and every region of this country through whatever this brutal winter pattern delivers. All glory always goes to God, our Father in heaven, Yahweh. I pray he protects every family through the cold, keeps every power grid running, and keeps every single one of you safe through winter 2026 to 2027. Amen. Hallelujah. Amen. Stay safe, everybody. Prepare now, and I will see you in the next update.